Sometime in the winter of 2012, Kathleen Kennedy drove north to Skywalker Ranch in Marin County, California. She had Abrams with her. Michael Arndt, the Oscar-winning screenwriter George Lucas had hired to develop Episode 7, was also there. The acquisition had closed 5 weeks earlier, on October 30th, for $4.05 billion. Lucas held the newly designated title of creative consultant. Kennedy was someone he had worked alongside for years, a figure in the professional orbit he shared with Steven Spielberg, a woman he had personally named as Lucasfilm co-chair before the deal was signed. When she walked through the gate at Skywalker Ranch that day, she was walking onto property belonging to a man who considered her, by every available measure, an ally. Abrams and Arndt began describing the plot for Episode 7. Bob Iger documented what happened next in his 2019 memoir, The Ride of a Lifetime, in language that closes every interpretive door. As the pitch continued, George Lucas immediately got upset, Iger's exact phrase, as the realization settled that we weren't using one of the stories he submitted during the negotiations. The documents Lucas had spent months formalizing, the written story visions for Episodes 7, 8, and 9, submitted as part of the acquisition agreement, purchased by Disney when they bought the company, built from 4 decades of accumulated notes, untouched in a drawer somewhere. Nothing adapted, nothing drawn from, nothing incorporated. The people who now owned his franchise had already decided to start from scratch, and they were delivering that information to George Lucas at his own table, on his own property. Iger included one more passage in that memoir that collapses any argument about how the decision was made. He named the participants and described the conclusion. The truth was, Kathy, JJ, Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. 4 people, Kennedy, Abrams, Alan Horn, and Iger himself, had reached a unanimous judgment before George walked in. He wasn't consulted. He wasn't asked to revise his vision or clarify his intent. The outcome had been determined in a room he hadn't been permitted to enter. George felt betrayed. That phrase, too, is Iger's, from the same memoir, and the documentary precision of it matters. This is the chief executive officer of the Walt Disney Company confirming, in a published book, that the man from whom his company purchased a $4.05 billion franchise felt that the transaction had been used against him. Iger writes that he views his handling of Lucas as a matter of some regret. That sentence carries significant weight, not because it constitutes an apology, it doesn't, but because a man of Iger's deliberateness doesn't write it without understanding exactly what it means. This is the account, not fan reconstruction, not inference from box office disappointment. The CEO of Disney wrote it down. Lucas had been building the sequel trilogy in his head since before Return of the Jedi opened in May 1983. His conceptual notes dated to the 1970s and 1980s, maintained alongside the original and prequel productions, a parallel track of thinking developed over the same decades he was building Lucasfilm itself. By early 2012, as Disney negotiations opened, he sat down and formalized those decades of thinking into written story visions for all 3 sequel films. He hired a professional screenwriter to execute the work. Michael Arndt had won the Academy Award for Little Miss Sunshine in 2007. Before the sale to Disney closed, Lucas brought Arndt into the project specifically to develop Episode 7 from his outline. Lawrence Kasdan confirmed this in an interview with Empire magazine. In 2012, Arndt had been hired to write a script for Episode 7, working from Lucas's material. When the $4.05 billion deal was signed, the sequel trilogy wasn't a theoretical concept waiting to be developed. It was an active creative project, a hired professional working from a formal document, backed by 40 years of accumulated mythology, with a filmmaker who had built one of the most successful franchise universes in cinema history, waiting to guide it forward. Disney purchased the written treatments as part of the acquisition. Iger confirmed in The Ride of a Lifetime that the deal included Lucas's outlines for 3 new movies. As a final condition before signing, Lucas negotiated that only a limited number of Disney employees could access them. Not a public document, not a press release. A restricted creative document, handled carefully, submitted in apparent good faith. The primary villain of that trilogy was Darth Maul. Paul Duncan's The Star Wars Archives documents a direct interview with Lucas confirming it. Duncan asked explicitly whether Maul was the main villain. Lucas said yes. The version Lucas planned wasn't the young warrior bisected at the waist in The Phantom Menace in 1999. That version had survived through the animated Clone Wars series via Mother Talzin's intervention. But an old Maul, his lower half replaced by mechanical legs, who had spent the decades since the Empire's collapse doing something far more methodical than fighting. As the Imperial government crumbled, someone had to fill the vacuum. The New Republic was busy stabilizing political institutions. Maul stepped into the space between law and chaos and built a criminal empire, becoming what Lucas described as the Godfather, controlling the underworld the way Palpatine had controlled the Senate, through patience, leverage, and the accumulated intelligence of a man who had watched governments fall from the inside. Maul operated with an apprentice. Lucas drew her from existing comics. Darth Talon, a Lethan Twi'lek Sith who had appeared in the Legacy comic run beginning in 2006. He described her as the new Darth Vader of the sequel trilogy, the active physical antagonist, the one the heroes would encounter and fight, while Maul directed from behind an organizational structure too large and too embedded to confront directly. Lucas called the dynamic explicitly. Darth Maul trained a girl, Darth Talon, who was in the comic books, as his apprentice. She was the new Darth Vader, and most of the action was with her. So Darth Maul was the Godfather. Two antagonists, classical Sith hierarchy. The old intelligence controlling the architecture of power, the young predator executing in the field. Luke Skywalker, in Lucas's vision, wasn't hiding from any of it. He was building. Multiple sources with high verification confidence confirm Lucas placed Luke as the Grand Master of a new Jedi Order, training Force-sensitive students, working to reconstitute what 2 generations of Sith had dismantled. The student at the center of that arc was a young woman Lucas called Kira. She would later be renamed Rey by Disney's development team after they discarded the framework around her. That fact deserves a pause. Disney kept the character. Specifically, the structural slot of Force-sensitive young woman trained in the new Jedi Order was retained in the finished product. What was stripped away was her relationship to a rebuilt order, her connection to a Grandmaster Luke who had spent 30 years deliberately constructing the Jedi's future, the entire context that gave her existence meaning. The skeleton of George's idea survived the discard. The architecture it stood in didn't. Leia's arc extended across all 3 films as the story's political and emotional center. Multiple sources confirm Lucas positioned her as the primary protagonist of the trilogy, the main compass, in the words of one documented account. A figure working to construct the New Republic, while her brother built the Jedi Order, the 2 of them operating in parallel to complete the work the original trilogy had only begun. In Lucas's vision, she also moved toward a Force leadership role she had been denied across 6 previous films. The thread of her latent abilities finally developed, rather than left as a footnote. And beneath all 3 storylines, Lucas had been building toward the answer to a question Star Wars had been circling since 1977. He had developed a concept called the Wills, microscopic Force-sensitive beings who, in his cosmology, were the actual governing intelligence behind everything. Lucas described them in a documented interview. "I call them the Wills, and the Wills are the ones who actually control the universe. They feed off the Force." The midichlorians introduced in The Phantom Menace weren't an aberration fans needed to explain away. They were a first step in a biological, cosmological argument Lucas planned to complete in the sequels. The thread that would lead from living cells to the beings those cells connected to, arriving at what the Force actually was. Not a metaphor. A cosmology. A mythology giving its audience an actual explanation of itself, following the thread from the molecular to the cosmic across 9 films. That was what George Lucas submitted to Disney. Written, formal, professionally developed, with a hired screenwriter actively working from the documents. 40 years of notes formalized into 3 connected story visions, covering 1 primary villain, 1 apprentice villain, 1 grandmaster protagonist, 1 political protagonist, and a philosophical architecture no other franchise on Earth had the conceptual depth to attempt. All of it purchased by Disney on October 30th, 2012. All of it set aside before Kathleen Kennedy's car reached Skywalker Ranch. The honest version of this story requires confronting the counter-argument directly, because it isn't a weak one. George Lucas chose to sell. He chose Disney as the buyer. He walked away with $4.05 billion and a title, creative consultant, that carried no real authority. The purchase agreement contained explicit language, stating Disney bore no contractual obligation to use his story visions. These were terms Disney built into the deal, and Lucas accepted. He also made a consequential personal decision. He chose Kathleen Kennedy to inherit his franchise. The trust was his to give, and he gave it freely. Nobody forced those choices on him. That's real accountability, and attributing none of it to Lucas would misrepresent what happened. But what Lucas is responsible for ends there. He submitted his visions. He hired a screenwriter. He negotiated access restrictions that suggested he understood the documents were valuable. He accepted a framework, creative consultant, relationship with Kennedy, the treatments as part of the deal, that apparently led him to believe his 4 decades of thinking would carry meaningful weight in what came next. The purchase agreement gave Disney legal cover. What it didn't give them was any defensible reason to arrange a creative meeting at Skywalker Ranch, invite the man whose franchise they just purchased, and use that meeting as the venue to inform him, while he sat there in his own home, that the decision to ignore his work had been made in a room he hadn't been allowed into. The sale placed responsibility on Lucas. The ranch meeting placed it somewhere else. Bob Iger approached the Lucasfilm acquisition with the strategic precision he had applied to every major Disney purchase. In June 2012, it was Lucas who reached out to Iger to begin negotiations. But Iger moved with institutional intent. The 2009 Marvel acquisition had proved the model. A mythology franchise combination with decades of accumulated character equity could be purchased and converted into a generation of content. Lucasfilm was the natural sequel to that logic. By October 30th, the deal was closed. What Iger did immediately afterward is structurally important. He appointed Kennedy as Lucasfilm president and handed her direct creative authority over the franchise. In The Right of a Lifetime, Iger is candid about the organizational decision he made. He wasn't going to manage Star Wars content himself. Kennedy would run Lucasfilm. He describes the early creative discussions about the sequel direction as a group conversation. Himself, Kennedy, Abrams, Alan Horn. But the day-to-day authority over what actually got produced sat with Kennedy. Iger was the architecture. Kennedy was the execution. The memoir's account of the decision to discard Lucas's vision is precise about the participants. Kathy, JJ, Alan, and I had discussed the direction in which the saga should go, and we all agreed that it wasn't what George had outlined. Iger names himself as one of 4 people who reached that conclusion. He then sent Kennedy to deliver it to Lucas. He writes that he views this handling as a matter of some regret. He told the New York Times that Disney might have put a little bit too much in the marketplace too fast. These are the statements of a man who has decided to absorb a calibrated degree of public accountability without admitting to anything actionable. The language of institutional regret that acknowledges effect without specifying cause. What Iger didn't say, in the memoir or anywhere public, was that Lucas's vision should have been used, or that discarding it was a creative mistake he'd undo if given the opportunity. The regret in the book is about how Lucas was made to feel. The decision itself, 4 people in a room, unanimous agreement, Lucas informed after the fact, is presented as a reasonable corporate judgment made by informed adults. That distinction matters when assigning weight to the responsibilities involved. Iger built the structure. He made the acquisition. He appointed the executive. He was present and named in the consensus decision, and he retained ultimate corporate authority over everything that happened inside Lucasfilm for the entire duration of the sequel trilogy's production. Kennedy reported to him. The decisions she made, hiring choices, creative direction, the absence of a unified story plan, were made within the architecture Iger constructed and inside an organization Iger ran. Kathleen Kennedy had not been a stranger to George Lucas when he appointed her. She had worked in the professional ecosystem connecting Lucas and Spielberg for years before the acquisition, a producer with a long resume and a relationship built on proximity to two of the most commercially powerful directors in Hollywood history. Lucas didn't choose a corporate operative he barely knew. He chose someone he trusted, someone from inside his professional world, and gave her the most important franchise he had built. She arrived at Lucasfilm with the full authority her title carried. Lucasfilm president meant direct creative control over story decisions, hiring decisions, production oversight, and the long-term strategic direction of the franchise. She wasn't an administrator executing someone else's creative vision. She was the person responsible for deciding what Star Wars would become. That authority was real, and the evidence of it's documented in what she chose to do with it. In 2018, Phil Lord and Christopher Miller were directing Solo, a Star Wars story. Their improvisational, comedy-inflected approach diverged from what Kennedy wanted for the production. She removed them from the film mid-shoot, one of the most visible interventions in recent Hollywood production history, and brought Ron Howard in to finish it. Kennedy didn't wait for the film to be delivered and released. She exercised her authority at the production level, in real time, to redirect a Star Wars film toward what she believed it should be. Nobody overrode that decision. Nobody removed her authority to make it. When Kennedy wanted creative control, she used it, and it held. She hired J.J. Abrams to direct The Force Awakens. Her account of how that conversation went? She called Abrams, told him he was the right person for the film, and eventually persuaded him to take it. She oversaw Rian Johnson's assignment to The Last Jedi. Every director who made a Disney-era Star Wars film was hired by Kathleen Kennedy, reported to Kathleen Kennedy, and could be removed by Kathleen Kennedy. The trilogy belonged to her in every meaningful, creative sense. The structural problem with the sequel trilogy, the thing that produced 3 films with no agreed-upon story spine, was eventually confirmed by Kennedy herself in her own public statements. When discussing The Force Awakens development, she acknowledged that the team had spent significant time working out all 3 movies, but that different directors subsequently took the story in different directions. That admission is worth holding. Lucas had submitted written visions for all 3 episodes before the sale closed. Kennedy's Lucasfilm, with $1 billion in Disney backing, 3 feature directors, and the full apparatus of one of the most powerful studios on Earth, produced 3 consecutive films whose story didn't cohere, by the account of the person who ran the company responsible for making them. Kennedy departed Lucasfilm in 2025, 13 years after the acquisition. Dave Filoni and Lin-Wen Brennan were named as her successors. In exit interviews reported by Deadline, she attributed the backlash against the sequel trilogy to the fans. After 13 years of creative authority over the most valuable franchise in American entertainment, the opportunity to deploy George Lucas's fully developed story vision, or build something equally ambitious from scratch, her public accounting blamed the audience that rejected the result. What Disney made with that authority, and with those resources, and with George's written story vision sitting unused, is most clearly understood through the individual decisions rather than the aggregate failure. The Force Awakens opened in December 2015. Abrams designed it as a structural callback to the original trilogy, a desert planet protagonist with latent force ability, crucial information stored inside a droid, a climactic assault on a superweapon, a beloved elder mentor killed at the emotional center of the third act. Abrams was transparent about the intent, reconnecting audiences to the emotional language of the original films after the prequel era had strained the relationship. As a commercial proposition, it worked. The film performed enormously at the global box office. As a story foundation, it left the trilogy with a specific structural problem. Everything the first film established as mysterious or unresolved, Rey's parentage, Kylo Ren's arc, the nature of the First Order's power structure, the political history of the 30 years between Jedi and Awakens, required answers the production had not yet invented. Building a franchise-opening film designed primarily to evoke emotion from what came before, rather than to establish where the story goes next, is a viable artistic choice. It requires knowing what comes next. Rian Johnson received no binding creative architecture when he came aboard The Last Jedi. The questions Abrams left open, Johnson answered with solutions he invented independently. Solutions that included declaring Rey's parentage meaningless, redirecting Kylo Ren's trajectory in ways that undermined the setup from the first film, and positioning Luke Skywalker as a man who had already failed at the thing Lucas's vision had him building. When J.J. Abrams returned for The Rise of Skywalker in December 2019, he reversed multiple major Last Jedi developments, resurrected a villain who had been killed on screen in Return of the Jedi, and explained that resurrection in the opening crawl because the narrative couldn't dramatize it. 3 films, 3 directors, 0 shared story spine. Lucas had written connected visions for all 3 episodes. A primary villain whose criminal empire drove the political conflict. An apprentice as the primary physical antagonist. A grandmaster protagonist building toward a generational handoff. Before the sale closed in October 2012. The difference isn't that Lucas's vision was guaranteed to succeed. The difference is that there was a vision. A connected, documented, 40-year-old story architecture covering all 3 films, submitted to the people who purchased the franchise, that was set aside before any camera rolled. No image from the sequel trilogy became a faster shorthand for what went wrong than one particular scene in The Last Jedi. Luke Skywalker on the island of Octo, on the rocky western coast of Ireland, standing in for an alien world, pulling a large sea creature against a flat rock and drinking the green liquid that came out of it. The scene is absurdist by design. Rian Johnson knew exactly what he was doing. He was building a portrait of an icon dismantled, a man who had tried to restart the Jedi Order and failed so catastrophically he had removed himself from the galaxy entirely, reduced to the mechanics of bare survival on a forgotten island at the edge of the map. Johnson's Luke doesn't want to be found. He doesn't want to train anyone. He doesn't want to be what he was. The green milk is the visual expression of that argument. This is what the galaxy's greatest hero looks like when the mythology has been stripped away from him. Not a warrior, a hermit with a fishing pole. The scene works as Rian Johnson intends it, if what Johnson was building is the story he was building. The problem is what it replaced. Lucas's Luke wasn't retreating. He was constructing. Every verified source on Lucas's sequel vision positions Luke as Grandmaster of a rebuilt Jedi Order, training Force-sensitive students, including Kira, the young woman who eventually became Rey after Disney's development team retained the character slot but discarded the context around it. Lucas's Luke had survived the Emperor's throne room with the accumulated wisdom of 2 masters and the emotional intelligence to turn Darth Vader back toward the light. In Lucas's vision, that Luke spent the next 30 years doing the most important work of his life, building something that would outlast him. Mark Hamill read Johnson's Last Jedi script. His response to Rian Johnson was documented in Star Wars and Philosophy Strikes Back. I fundamentally disagree with every choice you've made for this character. Not some choices, every choice. The man who has played Luke Skywalker since 1977, whose entire professional identity is inseparable from this character, delivered that verdict without qualification on reading the script. Hamill later softened his public position, saying he came to terms with the creative direction and ultimately delivered the performance Johnson needed. But his initial response, immediate and unambiguous, is the most honest document of what the gap between Lucas's Luke and Disney's Luke actually felt like to the person who knew the character best. The Luke who told Darth Vader there was still good in him, who staked his physical survival and his father's soul on an act of faith against all available evidence, became, in The Last Jedi, a man who stood over his sleeping nephew with a lit lightsaber because he sensed darkness in the boy. Not an ambush, not violence, just the momentary consideration of it, which Johnson presents as Luke's breaking point. However Johnson frames that scene cinematically, the character logic it requires is the opposite of everything Return of the Jedi had established. Lucas's Luke chose to believe in the redeemable core of the man who had murdered hundreds of Jedi and executed every rebel officer he encountered. Disney's Luke contemplated killing a child in his sleep. Hamill performed the scene. He also told the world, before he performed it, that he fundamentally disagreed with every choice that led to it. That's not a minor creative dispute. That's the man who built the character, telling you the character had been taken somewhere the character wouldn't go. Dave Filoni was 29 years old in 2005 when he arrived at Lucasfilm Animation to work on Star Wars: The Clone Wars. He came from a traditional animation background. He had worked on Avatar: The Last Airbender, and he walked into a production that George Lucas was personally and heavily involved in directing, not from a distance. Lucas ran story development on Clone Wars, was deeply engaged with the visual style, led creative sessions with Filoni present, and communicated his specific intentions about characters and canon in direct conversations that Filoni documented and carried forward throughout the production. What Filoni absorbed during those years wasn't just how to make Star Wars content. It was how Lucas thought about story, what the mythology was for, what the Force was supposed to represent, how character arcs in this universe were supposed to work, what visual storytelling principles Lucas had developed across 30 years of making these films. Filoni described Clone Wars as a creative mentorship unlike anything he had experienced in his prior career. Lucas wasn't a remote executive producer sending notes on drafts. He was, by all documented accounts, a creative force actively present in the work. When Filoni later co-created The Mandalorian with Jon Favreau, both men explicitly framed the series in relation to Lucas's storytelling philosophy, not as homage, but as continuation. The character at the center of The Mandalorian's most celebrated story development was a Force-sensitive infant of Yoda's species, initially identified only as the Child, and later named Grogu. Lucas had developed the Yoda species deliberately, an alien whose appearance suggested ancient wisdom, whose connection to the Force was inherent and profound, and had spent years in Clone Wars exploring what Force sensitivity looked like in young children. Grogu is, structurally, the continuation of that thread, a child with Force ability powerful enough to attract every dangerous faction in the galaxy, a living argument for why the Jedi Order had protected such children for 1,000 years before Palpatine destroyed it. The story built around Grogu, the protective bond between a found family and a Force-sensitive child, the question of what happens to Force-sensitive children in a world where the Jedi no longer exist, is the kind of story Lucas had been building toward when he outlined the Wills and the midichlorian cosmology. Small beings, enormous power, what the universe owes them. The Mandalorian premiered on Disney Plus in November 2019. The response to it, alongside the simultaneously unfolding Rise of Skywalker release cycle, illustrated the gap between what Lucas's instincts had built and what 13 years of Kennedy's Lucasfilm had produced. Filoni, mentored directly by Lucas, working with Lucas's storytelling philosophy as the explicit foundation of the project, made the most beloved Star Wars content of the Disney era. This isn't a marginal distinction. The Mandalorian revived genuine audience investment in the franchise at a moment when the sequel trilogy had spent that investment down to nearly zero. Filoni was named Lucasfilm co-president in 2025, alongside Lin-Wen Brennan, replacing Kennedy. The franchise is now in the hands of the person who studied most closely under its creator. Whatever comes next from that pairing will carry George Lucas's fingerprints more directly than anything made in the 13 years between October 2012 and Kennedy's departure. George Lucas left the ranch meeting visibly upset, in Iger's characterization. He didn't hide his disappointment from the Disney executives who had made the decision. He went home with the title of creative consultant and no documented path to influence what was being built in his name. His role in the sequel trilogy's development from late 2012 forward was, in practice, ceremonial. No documented instance exists of his consultation producing a substantive change to any creative decision in The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, or The Rise of Skywalker. He had access to the people making the films. He had the title that implied input. He had, by Iger's account, made his feelings clear. None of it changed what was built. By December 2015, when The Force Awakens opened, Lucas had watched 3 years of production on a sequel trilogy built on the premise that his vision wasn't what the saga needed. He gave a television interview around that time with Charlie Rose that has been cited and quoted and discussed in the Star Wars fan community ever since. What he said was this: they wanted to do a retro movie. And then, on what he had lost in the transaction. One thing I regret about Star Wars is that I never got to see it, you know? The sequel trilogy that Lucas had spent 40 years developing in parallel with everything else he made, the one that ended with the Wills, that followed Maul's criminal empire, that showed Luke as a builder. He never got to see that film. It was purchased and shelved. What he saw instead was a structural recreation of the original, made by people who had decided that revisiting the original was what the audience wanted. Lucas described the Star Wars films as his kids in that interview. He said he had sold them to white slavers, a remark he subsequently apologized for, the inflammatory language overtaking the underlying feeling he was trying to articulate. The apology doesn't erase the emotional register of the original statement, that he felt the people he had sold to had used his children for purposes that weren't his own, in ways he hadn't consented to, for reasons that had nothing to do with what he had built. The word he used was wrong. What it described was a man who had spent 40 years building a mythology, handed it to people who immediately announced they weren't going to use it, and watched them spend a decade making something he didn't recognize. His biggest stated regret, documented across multiple sources from the mid-2000s forward, was selling the rights to the story to Disney. There was a dimension to Lucas's situation that Star Wars mythology, of all cultural objects, is uniquely positioned to illuminate. Lucas spent years writing a story about how institutions get corrupted, about how good men get separated from everything they built through appeals to their trust, promises made in good faith, and relationships that turned out to serve different purposes than the ones that were declared. He wrote Palpatine's manipulation of the Republic into democracy's own machinery. He wrote Anakin's manipulation through the language of love and protection and fear. He wrote, across 6 films, a comprehensive mythology of how power uses trust as a weapon, how the most dangerous manipulation is always done by someone you invited close. The parallels to his own situation aren't imposed from outside. They are embedded in the story he spent his life telling. Whether the people involved understood that irony is unknowable from the documented record, that the irony exists isn't. The evidence in this case does not require speculation to produce a verdict. Bob Iger, CEO of the Walt Disney Company, confirmed in his own published memoir that he participated in the collective decision to discard Lucas's sequel vision. He confirmed that the decision was reached before Lucas was informed. He confirmed that George felt betrayed. He confirmed the names of the other participants, Kathleen Kennedy, J.J. Abrams, Alan Horn. The legal structure of the acquisition gave Disney the right to make those decisions. The purchase agreement is explicit on that point. What the purchase agreement couldn't do was determine whether those decisions were made with the good faith that Lucas's submission of his vision in the first place had assumed. Kathleen Kennedy ran Lucasfilm for 13 years with the full authority the role carried. She hired and fired directors. She set creative direction. She oversaw a trilogy that she publicly acknowledged lacked unified story planning. The vision George Lucas had spent 40 years building, Darth Maul's criminal empire, Luke's rebuilt Jedi Order, Leia's political arc, the Wills at the cosmological center of everything, none of it appears in the 3 films produced under her authority. Dave Filoni studied directly under Lucas. He carried those lessons into The Mandalorian. He is now running Lucasfilm. George Lucas, the man who built the mythology, who wrote the manual for how institutional trust gets weaponized against the people who extend it, is watching from outside. He gave away his kids. He watched what was done with them. He said publicly that he never got to see the films he spent 4 decades imagining. That statement is the most accurate summary of what happened between October 2012 and the present. The man who created Star Wars never got to see Star Wars. The Force, as a concept, was always about what survives after the individuals who built it are gone. It's in the films. Master dies, student carries it forward. The teaching doesn't end with the teacher. Filoni learned from Lucas. Lucas's cosmology, his instincts about story and character and the meaning of mythology survived the 13 years that set his sequel vision on fire. Whatever Filoni builds from here will carry more of George Lucas's actual vision than anything Kennedy's Lucasfilm produced. That's not absolution. It's consequence. The prosecution rests. If you want more stories told this way, subscribe.